The Colorado wind howled through the cracked timber of the lonely cabin. Carrying whispers of a ghost Clara Vance could not escape. She stood on the weathered porch, a fragile silhouette against the dying amber sun. Her beauty was undeniable, a delicate porcelain cracked by years of relentless sorrow and the cruel, judging whispers of the town below. She believed her heart was a graveyard, locked away forever beneath the heavy soil of grief and profound unworthiness. But as the dust settled on the horizon, a tall, broad-shouldered figure rode into the fading light. Elias Thorne was a man carved from the rugged earth itself, possessing a quiet strength and eyes that saw straight through her shattered armor. He did not come to judge her past, but to claim her future. If you love stories of shattered hearts finding true redemption, subscribe to Cowboy Echoes and journey with us into the untamed heart of the West. The morning sun offered absolutely no warmth to the isolated homestead sitting high above the sleepy town of Oakhaven. Clara Vance awoke to silence, so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She rose from the solitary bed, pulling a faded woolen shawl tight across her slender shoulders to ward off the biting mountain chill. Once, the townsfolk had marveled at her striking beauty, speaking of her deep raven hair that cascaded like spun midnight and eyes the color of a turbulent, stormy sea. Now, that same ethereal beauty was a source of scorn, a tragic reminder of the devastating misfortune that seemed to follow her like an inescapable shadow. Clara moved through the small, decaying cabin like a specter haunting her own life. The floorboards creaked beneath her light footsteps, the only sound in the hollow emptiness of her world. She kept the worn leather boots exactly where they had been left by the door 2 years ago. The heavy canvas coat still hung on its wooden peg, gathering dust. To move them, to alter preservation of this shrine, would be an unforgivable act of betrayal. She clung desperately to her sorrow because it was the only tangible proof she possessed that she had once been loved. Her husband, Arthur, had been a decent man, full of relentless optimism and grand dreams of conquering the untamed western soil. But the unforgiving land had claimed him, an unexpected sickness taking his life in the dead of winter, leaving Clara with nothing but a mountain of insurmountable debts and an echoing, empty existence. When Clara was forced to walk the dusty, uneven streets of Oakhaven to trade her meager collection of chicken eggs for essential flour and salt, the profound cruelty of her isolation became unbearable. Women in stiff cotton dresses would gather their skirts tightly and turn their faces away as she passed, pretending she was invisible. They whispered behind their hands that the delicate widow Vance was cursed, a harbinger of bad luck. They blamed her in their quiet, venomous ways, suggesting her fragile nature had driven Arthur to overwork himself into an early grave to provide for her. The general store owner pushed her meager supplies across the wooden counter, without ever lifting his eyes to meet hers, his silence speaking volumes of the town's collective disdain. Clara absorbed these silent, crushing judgments, accepting them as a righteous penance she inherently deserved. She believed every unspoken, harsh accusation, convincing herself entirely that she was unworthy of a place among the living. Her world had shrunk to the suffocating boundaries of her overgrown yard and the rotting walls of her home. The relentless physical labor of keeping the small, failing farm alive was slowly wearing her down to the bone. Her hands, once soft and pristine, were now callous, bruised, and stained with the unforgiving earth. Yet she worked the dry soil until her slender muscles screamed in agony, desperately hoping the sheer physical exhaustion would finally silence the relentless, condemning voices in her mind that told her she should have been the one in the ground. The burden of her beauty only isolated her further. The few men who dared to look her way did so with a predatory hunger, seeing only a vulnerable, desperate woman unprotected by the harsh laws of the frontier. To protect herself from their leering gazes and unwanted advances, Clara hid her elegant figure beneath layers of shapeless, heavy garments, keeping her head bowed and her eyes fixed on the dirt path. She made herself as small and unremarkable as possible, praying the world would simply forget she was there. As the afternoon dragged on, the sky outside began to darken long before evening, bruising with the heavy, ominous purple of an approaching high-country storm. Clara stood shivering by the drafty window, watching the fierce wind whip the dry prairie grass into a frantic frenzy. She knew the roof over the kitchen would leak, and she had barely enough split firewood to last a mild week, let alone a punishing western blizzard. As the first cold, hard drops of rain struck the thin glass, a profound and terrifying realization washed over her weary soul. She was fading away, dissolving day by day into the very ghost she mourned. As the wind howled like a wounded animal against the straining timber walls, Clara pressed her trembling hand against the cold pane. How much longer could her fragile spirit withstand the crushing, lonely weight of her own survival? And would this coming storm finally sweep away the last shattered remnants of the widow of Oakhaven? The sky above the sprawling Colorado plains bruised into a deep, turbulent violet, signaling a sudden tempest that would show absolutely no mercy to any living soul caught wandering the open, unprotected trail. The heavy, suffocating air crackled with the terrifying promise of violence as the first jagged streaks of silver lightning tore across the darkening horizon. Elias Thorne pulled the thick canvas collar of his heavy oilskin duster high against his neck, his broad, muscular shoulders easily absorbing the brutal, punishing gusts of wind that threatened to push his massive black stallion off the muddy, treacherous path. He was a man carved from the very essence of the untamed frontier, his striking, handsome features sculpted by years spent beneath the relentless, scorching sun and the howling, bitter winds of the open western range. Beneath the wide shadow of his weathered Stetson, his piercing hazel eyes remained perfectly calm and intensely steady, scanning the fading light with quiet, calculated vigilance of a lone wolf seeking sanctuary from the impending deluge. The freezing rain began to fall in thick, blinding sheets, transforming the dry, cracked earth into a dangerous sea of heavy, clinging mud that slowed their arduous journey to a grueling, exhausting crawl. Through the deafening roar of the downpour, a faint, flickering amber light pierced the suffocating gray curtain of the relentless storm. Elias urged his exhausted mount toward the solitary glow, his large, incredibly capable hands guiding the leather reins with practiced, soothing gentleness. As he slowly drew closer, the tragic silhouette of a deeply weathered, isolated cabin emerged from the driving rain. Its sagging roof and unpainted, rotting timber spoke volumes of years of profound neglect, bitter hardship, and quiet, desperate survival. It was a profoundly fragile structure, trembling violently against a furious, relentless assault of the wind, looking to the rugged cowboy as though a single, heavy gust might simply scatter its decaying bones across the desolate, unforgiving prairie. Elias felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening deep within his broad chest, a profound and immediate instinct to shield and protect whatever fragile life dared to exist in such a desolate, forgotten corner of the agonizingly lonely world. He swung his tall, imposing frame down from the heavy western saddle, his worn leather boots sinking deep into freezing mud as he led his shivering horse toward the small, dilapidated barn that leaned dangerously against the main house. He needed to secure his mount, But protocol and a deep ingrained sense of frontier honor dictated that he must announce his sudden presence to whoever was huddled inside the dark, trembling house. Inside the dim, drafty confines of the cold kitchen, Clara jumped violently as a heavy, deliberate knock echoed over the deafening, chaotic roar of the storm. The sudden sound was a terrifying, unprecedented intrusion into her isolated, carefully guarded sanctuary, sending a paralyzing jolt of pure, icy panic straight through her slender, trembling frame. She immediately backed away from the heavy wooden door, her delicate hands clutching her faded, threadbare woolen shawl tightly against her chest, as if the thin, worn fabric could somehow magically shield her from the unknown, masculine danger lurking on her porch. The knock came again, not angry, not demanding, but incredibly steady, deeply grounded, and completely impossible to ignore. Summoning a desperate, fragile shred of courage she did not even know she still possessed, Clara slowly reached for the rusted, freezing iron latch, her breath catching agonizingly in her throat as she pulled the heavy timber door open just a few hesitant, terrifying inches. The pale, flickering yellow light of her solitary oil lantern spilled out into the howling, furious darkness, instantly illuminating a towering, magnificent figure that seemed to completely fill the entire threshold. Elias stood perfectly still in the freezing downpour, heavy water cascading from the wide brim of his dark hat and streaming down the deep, rugged, incredibly handsome lines of his weathered face. For a long, suspended, eternal moment, neither of them spoke a single word. The raging, deafening storm around them seemed to mysteriously fade into a profound, suffocating, intensely heavy silence the absolute second their eyes finally met. Elias felt the very breath leave his powerful lungs as he looked down at the ethereal, deeply tragic beauty trembling violently before him. She looked exactly like a fragile, exquisitely crafted porcelain doll that had been carelessly left out to weather the brutal, unforgiving elements, her deep, stormy eyes swimming with a heartbreaking mixture of profound terror and an agonizing, unspoken loneliness that struck the hardened cowboy straight to his very core. He kept his massive, calloused hands completely still at his sides, deeply and acutely aware of his imposing, intimidating size and the wild, untamed, masculine energy he had just brought into her fragile, shattered, incredibly quiet world. He finally began, his voice a deep, rich, resonant rumble that somehow managed to perfectly cut through the shrieking wind with a comforting, remarkably steady warmth. I truly apologize for the sudden intrusion, but my horse and I are caught in the brutal teeth of this terrible storm. I only ask for a dry, quiet corner in your barn until the weather finally breaks. I give you my word as a man, I will bring you absolutely no harm. Clara stared up at him, her wounded heart hammering a frantic, terrifying, exhausting rhythm against her delicate ribs. She had spent 2 agonizing, excruciating years desperately hiding from the predatory, judging, cruel eyes of the world, yet the intense gaze of this towering, rugged stranger held absolutely no malice, no wicked intent, and no judgment. It held only a quiet, unwavering respect and a gentle, profound concern that terrified her wounded soul far more than the raging storm outside. She gave a barely perceptible, trembling nod, slowly stepping back to close the heavy door and grant him the silent permission he sought. But before the heavy, waterlogged one could safely meet the sturdy frame, a suddenly violent, shrieking, monstrous gust of wind tore viciously across the open porch. The rusted, weakened top hinge of the old cabin door snapped with a deafening, terrifying crack. The massive, crushing weight of the solid was tearing violently away from her delicate, fragile grasp. Clara let out a breathless, terrified cry as a heavy door swung violently inward, threatening to crush her slender, beautiful frame right against the hard kitchen wall. In a fraction of a second, Elias moved with a fluid, blinding, almost impossible speed that completely defied his massive, towering size. He lunged forcefully forward into the house, throwing his broad, incredibly powerful shoulder directly against a collapsing, heavy timber. His heavy leather boots braced fiercely against the worn, slippery floorboards as he caught the entire, crushing way of the door, just mere inches away from Clara's trembling, beautiful face. The sheer, overwhelming physical power of his immediate presence entirely surrounded her. Smelling intensely of fresh rain, worn saddle leather, and a deeply grounding, intensely masculine warmth that sent a sudden, shocking, undeniable tremor straight down her rigid spine. He held the shattered, heavy door firmly against the howling, furious fury of the storm, his powerful muscles straining visibly beneath his soaking wet coat, and he looked deeply down into her wide, terrified, mesmerizing eyes. The raging storm had finally broken through her physical defenses, bringing the untamed, powerful wilderness right over her threshold. But as the beautiful, deeply broken widow looked up at the towering, handsome cowboy physically shielding her from the tempest, a terrifying, earth-shattering question echoed loudly in the sudden chaos of her mind. Was this rugged, powerful stranger the ultimate salvation she had stopped praying for, or the final, overwhelming force that would completely and permanently shatter the fragile, lonely walls she had so carefully built around her bleeding heart? The heavy timber groaned under the immense, crushing pressure of the howling wind, but Elias did not yield a single inch. His broad shoulders formed an impenetrable wall against a violent tempest, the soaked canvas of his duster gleaming in the flickering lantern light like thick, deliberate strokes of dark oil paint on a distressed, shadowed canvas. Clara stood completely frozen, her breath caught painfully in the fragile column of her throat as she watched the sheer, unbridled power of this rugged stranger occupying the delicate threshold of her shattered world. The golden light from the distant hearth cast a warm, grainy hue over the cramped kitchen, illuminating the sharp, weather-beaten lines of his jaw and the heavy, dripping brim of his hat in exquisite, deeply cinematic detail. Every single drop of freezing rain that fell from his massive frame to the worn, splintered floorboards seemed to echo with the heavy, rhythmic cadence of a waking heart, a sound that Clara had not heard within these rotting walls for 2 agonizing years. With a low, feral grunt of exertion, Elias pushed his heavy leather boots fiercely against the slick wood, driving his immense weight forward to force the splintered door flush against his warped frame. He moved with a breathtaking, fluid grace that entirely defied his towering, mountainous size, swiftly reaching down to jam a heavy piece of split firewood tightly against the base of the door to secure it against the shrieking gale outside. The sudden, profound suppression of the storm's deafening roar left the small kitchen bathed in a suffocating, incredibly heavy silence, a quiet so thick and charged it felt as though the very air had been suddenly pulled from the room. Elias stood up slowly, his massive chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths, and turned to fully face the trembling, ethereal woman cowering against the far wall. He moved not with the heavy, careless entitlement of a man accustomed to taking whatever he pleased from the harsh frontier, but with the quiet, deliberate reverence of a weary soul stepping into a sacred, incredibly fragile sanctuary. Clara clutched her faded, threadbare shawl so tightly her knuckles turned to stark, translucent white, her wide, stormy eyes tracking his every subtle movement with a conditioned, frantic terror of a hunted doe cornered by a massive apex predator. But as Elias slowly raised his large, calloused hands, palms facing outward in a universal, silent gesture of peace and absolute surrender, she saw the undeniable, grounding warmth radiating from a steady, piercing hazel gaze. "I will just go secure my horse in your barn. Elias rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant poetry that vibrated through the damp, freezing air and settled deeply into the marrow of her aching bones. "I will not be but a moment, and then I will stay out of your way until the morning sun breaks this cursed weather." He did not wait for her trembling voice to grant him permission, seemingly deeply aware that forcing her to speak would only shatter the fragile, terrified composure she was desperately clinging to. Elias slipped back out into the raging, violent tempest, pulling the broken door securely shut behind him, leaving Clara completely alone in the sudden, echoing emptiness of her kitchen. For a long, suspended eternity, she simply stared at the heavy wooden planks, her wounded heart hammering a frantic, exhausting rhythm against her delicate ribs. She should have bolted the heavy iron latch, piled every broken chair and heavy table against the frame, and hidden herself away in the darkest, coldest corner of the bedroom until the rugged, terrifyingly handsome stranger finally rode away. The cruel, judging whispers of the town echoed loudly in her mind, warning her the inherent, violent dangers of the untamed Western men who roamed the desolate plains. Yet, as a violent, bone-chilling gust of wind rattled the thin window panes, Clara found her trembling hands moving with a strange, entirely foreign compulsion. She walked slowly toward the dying, gray embers of the hearth, her delicate fingers reaching for the small, precious pile of dry kindling she had been obsessively hoarding for the harshest days of winter. She struck a long wooden match against the stone, the sudden, sharp scent of sulfur and old wood filling the cramped space, and watched as the hungry, golden flames began to lick at the dry bark. It was an act of profound, deeply buried hospitality, a forgotten, nurturing instinct clawing its way up through the heavy, suffocating layers of her agonizing grief. She was preparing a warm, welcoming fire for a guest, a man whose sheer physical presence had effortlessly overpowered the raging storm and momentarily silenced the dark, haunting ghost that relentlessly tormented her soul. When Elias finally returned, slipping quietly through the secured door with the dripping, heavy saddlebag slung effortlessly over his broad shoulder, the kitchen was bathed in the warm, flickering, golden glow of the newly resurrected fire. He paused just inside the threshold, his striking, observant eyes immediately taking in the blazing hearth and the small, battered tin kettle now suspended precariously over the dancing flames. A profound, deeply moved softness touched the rugged, hardened corners of his mouth as he looked at the slender, beautiful widow standing nervously by the scarred wooden table, her head bowed and her raven hair falling in a thick, glorious cascade to hide her delicate, flushed face. Elias slowly shrugged off his soaking wet, heavy canvas duster, revealing a broad, immensely muscular chest clad in a damp, faded cotton shirt that clung tightly to his powerful torso. The sheer, overwhelming masculinity of his massive frame seemed to completely swallow the small, fragile room, introducing an intensely rich, earthy scent of worn saddle leather, fresh prairie rain, and a clean, vital sweat that made Clara's breath catch painfully in her throat once more. He hung his soaked coat on a wooden peg near the door, intentionally choosing a spot far away from the heavy canvas jacket that still hung perfectly preserved in its sacred, untouched place, a silent, deeply respectful acknowledgement of the profound loss that saturated every single inch of this decaying home. You should not have wasted your precious wood on my account, Elias said softly, his deep voice wrapping around her trembling senses like a heavy, protective blanket. Clara kept her stormy, sorrowful eyes firmly fixed on the rough grain of the wooden floorboards, her delicate fingers nervously tracing the frayed edge of her worn shawl. "It is terribly cold," she whispered, her voice so incredibly faint and fragile, it sounded like the delicate rustle of dry autumn leaves falling upon the frozen earth. "And you held the door when my strength failed. It is the very least I can offer." Elias stepped slowly toward the glowing hearth, his heavy footfalls intentionally soft and measured, acutely aware of the deeply ingrained fear radiating from her slender, beautiful form. He extended his large, weather-beaten hands toward the rolling flames, the golden, flickering light casting a cinematic, highly textured grain across the deep, masculine lines of his handsome face. He was remarkably close now, close enough for Clara to feel the intense, radiating heat of his large body, close enough to see the fine, silver scars mapping the rough, tan skin of his knuckles. It was a suffocating, incredibly overwhelming intimacy, a forced, immediate proximity that completely stripped away the thick, protective walls of isolation she had so carefully constructed around her bleeding heart. He turned his head slightly, his piercing hazel eyes locking onto her delicate, porcelain profile with an intensity that made her deeply wounded soul ache with sudden, inexplicable yearning. "You are shivering, ma-am." Elias observed the low, rumbling poetry of his words carrying a gentle, undeniable authority. "It is only the damp," Clara lied, a fragile, deeply unconvincing defense suspended heavily in the charged, incredibly tense air between them. Elias slowly shook his head, his gaze never once wavering from her beautiful, tragic face. "No," he murmured softly, stepping just a fraction of an inch closer, close and profound, agonizing distance between his towering strength and her delicate, shattering fragility. "You are shivering because you have been carrying the freezing, crushing weight of this entire world on your shoulders for far too long, and you are terrified to finally set it down." The blunt, unapologetic truth of his quiet observation struck Clara with a devastating, undeniable force of physical blow. A sudden, hot rush of unshed tears burned furiously behind her eyes, the heavy, suffocating dam of her carefully maintained sorrow threatening to break completely under the gentle, probing weight of his profound understanding. No one in the cruel, judging town of Oakhaven had ever looked at her and seen anything more than a cursed, tragic burden, a delicate, fragile thing meant to be scorned and pushed into the darkest shadows. Yet this rugged, untamed cowboy, a man who had ridden straight out of the violent tempest, saw the deep, bleeding wounds of her soul with a clarity that was both completely terrifying and agonizingly beautiful. As a furious storm continued to rage wildly through the pitch-black, unforgiving frontier night, violently battering the fragile, rotting walls of the isolated cabin, Clara stared blindly into the dancing, golden embers and trembled violently. She was profoundly, terrifyingly aware that the true, overwhelming danger was no longer the howling, destructive wind tearing across the open plains outside, but the sudden, terrifying, deeply reawakening warmth taking permanent root in the frozen, dead soil of her own shattered heart. Could her fragile, wounded spirit possibly endure the agonizing, excruciating pain of finally thawing, or would this rugged, silent protector eventually realize that beneath her striking, delicate beauty, she was absolutely nothing more than a hollow, hopelessly broken shell completely unworthy of salvation? The morning broke over the sprawling Colorado frontier with a muted, breathtaking stillness, painting the vast and lonely landscape in the soft, texture hues on old oil painting. The violent tempest of the previous night had completely spent its fury, leaving behind profound, crystalline silence and a world washed clean by the heavy rains. Inside the drafty bedroom of the decaying cabin, Clara Vance slowly opened her stormy, exhausted eyes, her senses immediately registering a subtle, profound shift in the very atmosphere of her home. The familiar, suffocating weight of absolute isolation that usually greeted her every waking moment had been inexplicably altered, replaced by the faint, rhythmic, and deeply grounding sound of metal striking solid wood. She lay perfectly still beneath her heavy, faded quilt, watching the early sunlight filter through the cracked window pane like dusty ribbons of spun gold, illuminating the microscopic particles of dust dancing slowly in the quiet air. For 2 agonizing years, she had woken up to absolutely nothing but the crushing, deafening silence of her own profound grief. Yet today, the steady, rhythmic thud of a heavy hammer echoing from the front porch felt like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, bringing the dead, rotting timber of her world back to life. Clara rose from the cold bed with a hesitant, trembling grace, wrapping her worn, threadbare shawl tightly over her simple cotton dress. She moved silently across the creaking floorboards, her bare feet intimately familiar with every splinter and groove of the decaying house. She fully expected to find the kitchen empty, to discover that the towering, rugged cowboy who had shielded her from the storm had simply vanished into morning mist like a fleeting, impossible dream. Instead, as she stepped into the cool, shadowed space of the kitchen, she saw the heavy front door standing wide open to the crisp morning air. Elias Thorne was fully immersed in his grueling work, his massive, powerful frame bathed in the warm, golden light of the rising sun. He had discarded his heavy canvas duster and his worn flannel shirt, leaving his broad, heavily muscled torso exposed to the crisp chill of the mountain morning. Clara froze entirely in the threshold, her breath catching painfully in her delicate throat as she was presented with a profoundly cinematic, intensely striking vision of raw, untamed masculine strength. The cinematic morning light sculpted the deep, heavy contours of his back and shoulders, highlighting the fine, silver sheen of sweat that covered his sun-bronzed skin. Every swing of the heavy iron hammer sent a powerful, fluid ripple of sheer physical power through his massive arms, a mesmerizing display of capability and protective force that made Clara's wounded heart flutter like a trapped, frantic bird against her ribs. He was meticulously, patiently repairing the shattered upper hinge of her heavy oak door, using thick, sturdy square nails he must have carried in his own weathered saddlebags. He did not work with haste, but with deliberate, reverent care, treating the broken, rotting timber of her fragile sanctuary with the same gentle, profound respect he had shown her wounded soul the night before. Clara stood frozen in the deep shadows, entirely captivated by the rough, callous texture of his large hands as they effortlessly manipulated the heavy iron tools. She felt an unexpected, terrifyingly hot flush of pure, undeniable awareness bloom deep within her chest, a sudden, acute realization of her own buried femininity, responding instinctively to his overwhelming, protective presence, as if he could physically feel the heavy, trembling weight of her stormy gaze upon his bare back. Elias paused mid-swing, lowering the heavy hammer and turning his handsome, weather-beaten face toward the dark doorway. His piercing hazel eyes immediately found her fragile silhouette hiding in the shadows, and a slow, breathtakingly warm smile touched the rugged, hardened corners of his mouth. "Good morning, ma'am," he rumbled softly, his deep, resonant voice wrapping around her shattered senses like a thick, comforting woolen blanket. "I hope the noise of my fixing did not wake you. The wood is a bit stubborn, but it will hold strong against the next wind." Clara swallowed hard, her delicate fingers nervously clutching the frayed edges of her faded shawl as she slowly stepped out into the warm, golden light of the porch. "You did not have to do this," she whispered, her voice incredibly fragile, trembling with a heartbreaking mixture of profound gratitude and deep, ingrained fear. "You asked only for shelter in the barn. You owe me absolutely no labor for a simple fire." Elias reached for his faded flannel shirt draped carefully over the porch railing, pulling the worn fabric slowly over his massive shoulders. "I was raised to believe a man always leaves a place a little better than he found it," he replied, his steady gaze holding her wide, fearful eyes with a gentle, unwavering anchor. "And my horse pulled a slight muscle in the deep mud yesterday. If you would graciously permit it, I would kindly ask to make camp in your lower pasture for a few days to let him rest. I can earn my keep by mending that broken western fence line and chopping your winter wood." It was a profoundly polite, incredibly transparent excuse, a gentle, unspoken negotiation designed entirely to bypass her terrified, defensive walls. Clara looked at the towering, powerful man standing before her, a man capable of surviving the harshest, most brutal elements of the untamed frontier, and knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that his magnificent stallion was perfectly fine. He was choosing to stay. He was looking at the tragic, broken decay of her isolated life and choosing to offer his immense strength to physically hold the crumbling pieces together. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his unselfish devotion terrified her far more than the harsh cruelty of the town below. "Yes," she finally breathed, her voice barely a fragile whisper carried on the morning breeze. "You may stay." Over the next 4 days, a strange, quiet, and deeply profound rhythm settled over the isolated, high-country farm. Elias Thorne moved through Clara's shattered, lonely world with the steady, unstoppable force of a gentle river slowly carving its way through solid stone. He did not push her to speak of her haunting past. He did not demand her precious time. And he never once looked at her with the predatory, hungry entitlement she had come to expect from a harsh man of the frontier. Instead, he simply worked. He swung a heavy, rusted axe from the first light of dawn until the sky bruised into deep twilight, transforming the massive, rotting logs behind the barn into a monumental, perfectly stacked mountain of essential winter firewood. He rebuilt the collapsed, heavy timber fences with his bare hands, his massive shoulders straining against the stubborn, unforgiving earth. Clara found herself utterly unable to look away. She would stand quietly by the small, cloudy kitchen window, her delicate hands resting against the cold glass, watching the rhythmic, mesmerizing rise and fall of his heavy axe. She studied the rich, weathered texture of his leather suspenders, the deep, rugged lines of his handsome profile against the burning, oil-painted sunsets, and the incredibly gentle, patient way he spoke to his massive black horse. Every single swing of his axe, every sturdy nail he drove into the rotting wood of her home, felt like a deliberate, profound strike against the heavy, suffocating walls of ice that had encased her broken heart for 2 agonizing years. He was not just repairing a decaying farm. He was meticulously, silently rebuilding the very foundation of her shattered spirit. The subtle, unspoken intimacy between them grew with every passing hour, built entirely on quiet, shared moments of profound necessity. Clara began to anticipate his heavy, steady footsteps on the porch, her wounded heart instinctively lifting at the deep, resonant rumble of his voice. She found herself carefully washing her worn cotton dresses with newfound, desperate care, brushing the thick, cascading raven waves of her hair until they shone like polished midnight glass. She was utterly terrified by this sudden, profound awakening, this desperate, blooming yearning to be beautiful in his observant, piercing eyes. On the evening of the fourth day, the golden, cinematic light of the setting sun cast long, sweeping shadows across the worn floorboards of the quiet kitchen. Elias sat heavily at the small, scarred wooden table, his massive frame radiating the intense, comforting heat of a full day of brutal physical labor. Clara stood at the iron stove, carefully pouring a measure of steaming, dark coffee into a battered tin cup. As she turned to bring it to him, her stormy eyes caught a sudden, sharp glint of deep crimson against the tanned, callous skin of his large left hand. A heavy, jagged splinter of rough timber had torn a deep, angry gash across his knuckles, the wound steadily weeping dark blood that he was entirely, stubbornly ignoring. "You are bleeding," she stated, her delicate voice trembling with a sudden, overwhelming surge of protective instinct that entirely shocked her battered soul. Elias glanced down at his large, injured hand with a dismissive, incredibly casual shrug. "It is just a scratch from the fence rail, ma am. The wood out there is mighty unforgiving. It is nothing to fuss over." "Sit perfectly still," Clara commanded, the fragile, timid whisper of the broken widow suddenly replaced by a deeply buried, fiercely nurturing authority. She moved swiftly to the small wooden wash basin, soaking a clean, white linen cloth in warm water, and gathering a small tin of soothing herbal salve. She returned to the table, pulling up a wooden chair and sitting so incredibly close to him that the sheer, overwhelming physical proximity stole the very breath from her lungs. She reached out with trembling, delicate fingers, her pale, incredibly soft hands gently cradling his massive, rough, weather-beaten palm. The immediate, shocking contrast between them was breathtakingly cinematic. Her hands were small, elegant, and fragile like carved porcelain, completely dwarfed by the heavy, imposing, incredibly capable size of his rugged hand. As she gently pressed the warm, damp cloth against the deep cut, she felt the sudden, heavy flinch of his powerful muscles, followed immediately by a profound, trembling stillness. She looked up through the thick, dark curtain of her eyelashes, expecting to see pain, but found his piercing hazel eyes locked intensely onto her face with a burning, raw, and completely undisguised devotion that sent a powerful, electric shock straight to her very core. The heavy, suffocating silence of the kitchen stretched into eternity, charged with thick, undeniable, and deeply sensual tension that crackled in the narrow space between their rapidly beating hearts. Elias did not move a single muscle, his breathing turning incredibly shallow and ragged as her soft, gentle fingertips slowly massaged the soothing salve into his torn, callous skin. It was the absolute first time in 2 agonizing years she had willingly touched another human soul, and the profound, scorching heat radiating from his powerful body made her head spin with a terrifying, intoxicating vertigo. She could feel the steady, heavy thud of his pulse drumming wildly beneath her delicate thumb, matching the frantic, terrified racing of her own deeply wounded heart. "Thank you, Clara," he whispered, his deep voice dropping an entire octave, wrapping around her beautiful name like a sacred, deeply cherished prayer. Clara carefully wrapped a thin strip of clean linen around his massive hand, her stormy eyes dropping down to the rough grain of the table. She felt completely exposed, utterly vulnerable beneath the heavy, consuming weight of his intense gaze. She was starting to desperately need the quiet comfort of his towering presence, starting to crave the deep, resonating sound of his voice and the safe, impenetrable wall of his broad shoulders. But as she gently released his hand and stepped back into the cold shadows of the kitchen, her eyes inevitably fell upon the heavy canvas coat, still hanging perfectly preserved on its wooden peg by the door. The devastating, crushing weight of her profound guilt crashed back down upon her fragile shoulders. How could she possibly allow this rugged, magnificent cowboy to bring the warm, golden light of life back into her desperate soul, when her dead husband's memory was still actively bleeding into the very soil she stood upon? Was her desperate, undeniable yearning for Elias Thorne a beautiful, triumphant return to the living, or the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal of the tragic ghost that still claimed her broken heart? The bitter chill of late autumn finally descended upon the high plains of Oakhaven, stripping the last clinging, golden leaves from the ancient cottonwood trees, and painting the morning frost in thick, sparkling sheets of silver ice. Elias Thorne had been at the isolated farm for nearly 2 weeks, long past the time required to mend a broken door or rest a weary stallion. In that short span of time, he had meticulously, quietly transformed the decaying landscape of Clara Vance into a fortress of absolute, undeniable security. The heavy roof no longer leaked when the cold rains fell. The massive barn doors swung smoothly on freshly oiled iron hinges, and a monumental, towering fortress of chopped firewood stood ready to defy the coming winter snows. He had physically rebuilt the boundaries of her world, but the terrifying, intricate walls guarding her deeply wounded heart were proving to be a much more formidable, agonizing challenge. Clara found herself entirely consumed by a terrifying, deeply exhausting internal war. Every single morning, she awoke to the deep, resonant, incredibly grounding sound of his voice, speaking gently to his black horse in the freezing dawn. She spent her days hopelessly intoxicated by the sheer, imposing reality of his massive frame moving effortlessly across her property, the rich, earthy scent of wood smoke and worn leather that lingered in the kitchen long after he stepped outside. She was undeniably, profoundly coming back to life, the vibrant, natural color returning to her delicate porcelain cheeks and a soft, incredibly fragile light slowly illuminating the stormy, tragic depths of her raven eyes. But with this beautiful, undeniable resurrection came a crushing, suffocating wave of profound guilt that threatened to completely drown her. The heavy canvas coat still hung on its wooden peg by the door, a silent, damning sentinel constantly reminding her of the tragic ghost she was meant to mourn forever. Every time Clara felt her heart flutter wildly at the heavy sound of Elias stepping onto the porch, every time she caught herself desperately longing for the rough, callous touch of his large hand or the intense, protective warmth of his hazel gaze, she felt she was committing an unspeakable, horrifying betrayal. The cruel, venomous whispers of the town below echoed relentlessly in her mind, reminding her that she was a cursed, broken thing. She had convinced herself entirely that her delicate, fragile nature had somehow dragged her late husband into his early grave, and she lived in absolute, paralyzing terror that her dark, tragic shadow would eventually destroy this magnificent, rugged cowboy as well. On a particularly brutal, freezing Tuesday evening, the heavy, suffocating weight of her silent agony finally reached its absolute, devastating breaking point. The sky outside the frosted window panes was a bruised, terrifying expanse of pitch black, and the fierce mountain wind howled violently around the sturdy, reinforced timber of the cabin. Elias was sitting quietly by the roaring hearth, his long, heavily muscled legs stretched comfortably toward the glowing heat, the flickering golden light casting deep, dramatic shadows across the rugged, handsome planes of his face. He was meticulously cleaning his heavy Western revolver his large, incredibly capable hands moving with a fluid, mesmerizing precision that Clara usually found deeply comforting. But tonight, the sheer, overwhelming domesticity of the scene, the beautiful, heartbreaking illusion that they were a natural, enduring family, shattered her fragile composure entirely. Clara stood by the scarred wooden table, her delicate hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the heavy cast iron skillet she was cleaning. She stared blindly at the dark, freezing window, completely paralyzed by the sudden, horrifying conviction that she had to stop this beautiful dream before it turned into another devastating nightmare. She had to send him away. She had to push the towering, protective cowboy back out into the harsh, unforgiving frontier before he realized the terrible, broken truth of her cursed existence. It was the only way to save him from her tragic fate, and the only way to prove her undying, suffering loyalty to the heavy coat, hanging by the door. With a ragged, shallow breath that physically tore her throat, Clara carefully set the heavy skillet down on the counter. She turned to face his broad, powerfully built back, wrapping her worn, threadbare shawl tightly around her slender, shivering frame as if preparing for a violent physical blow. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice incredibly fragile but lined with a forced, brittle coldness she had never directed at him before. Elias paused his quiet work immediately, the heavy claw stilling in his large hands. He did not turn around right away, but Clara could see the sudden, subtle tension ripple across the massive width of his broad shoulders, as if he could already feel the freezing, unnatural shift in the warm air between them. "Yes, Clara," he rumbled softly, his deep voice cautious, waiting for the heavy, impending storm. "You have done more than enough," she stated, forcing her stormy eyes to remain fixed firmly on the rough grain of the floorboards, absolutely terrified that if she looked into his piercing gaze, her shattered resolve would crumble to dust. "The roof is fixed, the wood is chopped, and your horse is fully rested. The heavy snows will be arriving soon to block the mountain pass. You must ride out tomorrow morning at first light." A heavy, absolute, and suffocating silence instantly fell over the cramped kitchen, completely swallowing the cheerful crackle of the blazing hearth. Elias slowly placed the heavy iron revolver down on the stone hearth. He stood up with a deliberate, towering slowness, turning his massive, imposing frame to fully face the fragile, trembling woman standing in the shadows. He did not look angry, nor did he look surprised. Instead, his striking hazel eyes were filled with profound, piercing sorrow and a deep, terrifying understanding that stripped away every single one of her pathetic, brittle defenses. Clara took a desperate, frantic step backward, her back pressing hard against the cold wooden counter. "I have packed a heavy sack of flour and dried meat for your journey," she continued rapidly, her delicate voice trembling, rushing the desperate words into the charged, heavy air. "I cannot pay you in heavy coin for your hard labor, but you may take whatever supplies you need from the cellar. I simply need you to leave my property." Elias closed the distance between them with 3 slow, heavy, incredibly deliberate strides, stopping just inches away from her trembling, beautiful form. He was so close she could feel the intense, radiating heat of his powerful chest, smell the deep, intoxicating scent of pine and raw masculinity that had completely consumed her waking thoughts. He looked down at her bowed head, his massive presence effortlessly surrounding her, demanding her absolute attention. "Look at me, Clara," he commanded, his deep, resonant voice incredibly soft, yet carrying an undeniable, earth-shattering authority that she could not possibly ignore. Clara shook her head frantically, a hot, desperate tear escaping her thick raven lashes, and tracking a shining, silver path down her pale cheek. "Please," she whispered, her voice shattering into 1,000 agonizing pieces. "Just go. You do not belong in this dead, rotting place." Elias raised his large, callous hands, moving with excruciating, agonizing slowness, and gently cupped her delicate, trembling face. His rough thumbs tenderly wiped away the hot, falling tears. His touch so incredibly gentle and reverent it physically broke her heart in two. He tilted her face up, forcing her to finally meet the intense, burning devotion in his steady eyes. "I am not a man who runs from a storm, Clara," he murmured deeply, his breath fanning across her tear-stained skin. "And I am certainly not a man who walks away from the only living thing in this entire untamed frontier that has managed to make my weary soul feel like it has finally come home. You do not understand," Clara sobbed, the heavy, crushing dam of her agonizing guilt finally bursting open, completely flooding her senses with absolute panic. "You do not know the terrible things the town says about me. I am cursed. I am a broken, heavy burden. He gave me everything. He worked his hands to the very bone for my comfort, and the harsh land took him because of my weakness. I am nothing but a fragile, hollow shell holding on to a ghost. If you stay here, my dark shadow will ruin you just as it ruined him." She reached up with her small, delicate hands, pushing frantically against the solid, unyielding iron of his massive chest, desperately trying to force him away. But Elias did not budge a single, solitary inch. He simply stood perfectly still, absorbing her frantic, desperate grief, a towering, indestructible mountain, refusing to be moved by the violent, thrashing tempest of her profound pain. "Arthur was a good man," Elias stated, his voice ringing with a deep, absolute, unshakable truth. "But he is gone, Clara. He is gone, and he would never want you to bury your beautiful, vibrant soul in the cold, unforgiving earth right beside him. You are not a curse. You are the strongest, most breathtakingly beautiful woman I have ever known. You survived 2 brutal years in this terrible isolation, fighting the unforgiving frontier and the cruel judgments of bitter people, all on your own. You are not broken. You are just terrified to finally let yourself be caught." He moved his hands from her face, sliding his powerful arms heavily around her slender waist and pulling her completely flush against the massive, solid wall of his chest. The sheer, overwhelming physical contact was blinding, a brilliant, terrifying clash of his untamed, grounded strength against her delicate, shattering fragility. Clara gasped, her trembling hands automatically curling into the soft, worn flannel of his shirt, her stormy eyes wide with absolute, breathless panic. She was entirely trapped within the fierce, protective cage of his embrace, the powerful, heavy rhythm of his beating heart echoing loudly against her own ribs. "Let go of the ghost, Clara," Elias whispered fiercely, his handsome face lowering until his lips were mere agonizing fractions of an inch from hers. The heavy, sensual tension between them roaring like a massive, uncontrollable wildfire. "Let the dead have their peaceful rest, and let me claim what belongs to the living." The heavy wind shrieked violently outside the frosted windows, wildly rattling the thick timber of the dark cabin. Clara stood completely suspended in the terrifying, deeply intimate warmth of the rugged cowboy's arms, the heavy, tragic past actively screaming at her to pull away and hide in the cold shadows, while the beautiful, terrifying promise of vibrant, living future burned fiercely against her trembling skin. Would the beautiful, tragic widow finally surrender the heavy, suffocating chains of her haunted past to this towering, magnificent protector, or would her deep, Agonizing fear destroying him forced her to completely shatter her own desperately beating heart one final, irreversible time. The fierce mountain wind shrieked with a wild, primordial fury, violently hammering against the reinforced timber walls of the dark kitchen as if demanding entrance into the sacred, intensely charged sanctuary of their shared breathing. Clara stood perfectly frozen within the iron circle of Elias Thorne's powerful embrace, her small, elegant hands still desperately clutching the soft, faded flannel of his shirt, her knuckles showing a stark, translucent white against the warm, golden light of the dancing hearth. She could feel the relentless, heavy thudding of his heart beneath her sensitive palms, a deep, primitive rhythm that seemed to completely drown out the chaotic roar of the tempest outside and shatter the heavy, suffocating silence that had enslaved her soul for 2 agonizing years. He was a towering, indestructible mountain of pure, untamed masculine strength, a man who refused to move a single, solitary inch despite the frantic, desperate thrashing of her profound, bleeding grief. Every single nerve in her slender, fragile frame was screaming at her to run, to tear herself away from the intoxicating, dangerous warmth radiating from his massive chest and retreat back into familiar, freezing safety of her dark, lonely shadows. Her mind raced with a terrifying, exhausting velocity, flooded with the cruel, venomous whispers of the townspeople who had spent months calling her a cursed, broken burden, a fragile thing meant to be pushed away and forgotten. She believed with absolute, agonizing certainty that her love was an instrument of pure destruction, a dark, tragic fate that had already dragged her late husband into an early grave and would eventually consume this magnificent, rugged cowboy if she dared to let him stay. But as Elias held her flush against his solid, muscular torso, his large, calloused hands resting heavily against the small of her slender back, she felt a sudden, shocking surge of a long-forgotten sensation blooming deep within the dead, frozen soil of her heart. It was a fierce, protective heat that entirely defied the biting alpine winter, a vital, primal energy that demanded she stop mourning the dead and finally open her eyes to the magnificent, living reality standing right before her. Elias lowered his handsome, weather-beaten face until his sharp jawline was mere fractions of an inch from her porcelain temple, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that sent a powerful, electric tremor traveling down her rigid spine. He did not tighten his grip with an aggressive, demanding force, but rather with an unyielding, absolute devotion, transforming his massive body into an impenetrable shield that effortlessly absorbed the entirety of her frantic, desperate panic. "I told you, Clara," he whispered, his deep, resonant voice dropping into a low, rumbling rumble that vibrated straight through her chest and settled permanently into the marrow of her aching bones. "I do not care about his ghost. I do not care about the cruel, bitter lies whispered by small men in a small town who are too blind to see the incredible, resilient strength of the woman standing right in front of them. His memory does not frighten me, and your dark shadows will never be enough to drive me away from this mountain." Clara lifted her stormy, beautiful eyes, her thick raven lashes wet with hot, cascading tears that caught the brilliant, cinematic amber glow of the dying fire. "Look at me, Elias," she sobbed, her delicate voice breaking into 1,000 shattered, agonizing pieces against the hard planes of his chest. "Look at this house. Look at my calloused, ruined hands. Look at the way the world turns its back on me whenever I walk down the street. I have absolutely nothing left to give a man like you. I am completely hollowed out by sorrow, a broken doll holding on to a name that belongs to the dust. I cannot love you the way you deserve to be loved, because every single piece of my heart is buried, beneath the freezing earth out in that lonely pasture. Elias looked down into her wide, mesmerized eyes, his piercing hazel gaze burning with a raw, fierce, and entirely undisguised passion that made her head spin with a sudden, intoxicating vertigo. He slowly reached up with one large, scarred hand, his rough fingers tracing the delicate line of her jaw before burying themselves deeply into the thick, cascading waves of her midnight hair, tilting her face up to face his absolute truth. "Then let me give you my strength until yours finally returns, Clara," he murmured fiercely, his lips brushing softly against her trembling, wet cheek. "Let me swing the axe, let me build the fences, and let me stand between you and the cruel judgments of the world until you remember exactly who you are. Your heart is not buried in the dirt, sweet girl. It is beating right here against mine, and I swear to you on my mother's soul, I will spend every single day of my natural life proving to you that you are worthy of being seen, worthy of being protected, and worthy of being loved by a living man." The blunt, unconditional honesty of his confession struck her with the devastating, redemptive force of a localized lightning strike, completely sundering the thick, protective walls of ice she had spent 2 excruciating years constructing around her bleeding soul. A sudden, breathless gasp escaped her trembling lips as the last remaining, brittle defenses of her grief crumbled entirely into dust, leaving her completely exposed, utterly vulnerable and beautifully alive in the fierce, protective cage of his arms. She realized with profound, earth-shattering clarity that her agonizing guilt was not a monument of loyalty to her dead husband, but a heavy, self-inflicted chain that was preventing her from accepting the salvation she had stopped praying for. With a low, desperate cry that carried the cumulative weight of 2 years of unbroken loneliness, Clara finally stopped fighting the towering cowboy. She surrendered her slender frame entirely to his immense, comforting bulk, her arms lifting from his chest to wrap tightly around his massive neck, burying her face into the crook of his warm, solid shoulder. She wept openly, her small body shaking with violent, cleansing sobs as a heavy, suffocating dam of her sorrow broke completely open, pouring her agonizing pain out into the crisp, clean fabric of his flannel shirt. Elias let out a deep, ragged sigh of pure, profound relief, his powerful arms tightening around her waist like bands of solid iron as he lifted her slightly off the worn floorboards, cradling her fragile beauty against his heart as if she were the most precious, sacred thing in the entire untamed western frontier. He held her close through the long, dark hours of the howling tempest, his large hands gently stroking her raven hair and his deep, soothing voice whispering quiet, unshakable promises of safety, redemption, and an enduring tomorrow into the quiet spaces of the room. As the furious mountain storm slowly began to spend its final, desperate energy outside, the heavy, suffocating darkness that had claimed the cabin for so long was steadily replaced by the warm, constant, and redemptive glow of the resurrected hearth. Clara lay her head against Elias's broad chest, listening to the steady, unshakable rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound that no longer felt like a terrifying intrusion, but rather like the first beautiful notes of a grand, cinematic dawn. But as the dark night finally began to give way to the pale, silver light of an approaching morning, a quiet, lingering tension remained suspended in the cool air of the room. The ghosts of her past had finally been banished from the warmth of the kitchen, but would the cruel, judging townsfolk of Oakhaven allow the beautiful, resurrected widow and her towering, handsome protector to build a peaceful, enduring future together on the ashes of her tragedy? Or would the harsh reality of the frontier find a way to tear them apart before their true healing could even begin? The pale, silver light of dawn broke cleanly over the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains, filtering through the clean, frosted glass of the cabin window and bathing the quiet kitchen in a soft, ethereal glow. The furious alpine storm had completely retreated, leaving behind a vast, pristine wilderness covered in a heavy, brilliant blanket of fresh white snow that sparkled like millions of tiny diamonds beneath the rising sun. Inside the warm sanctuary of the cabin, the heavy canvas coat that had hung for 2 long years on its wooden peg by the door was gone. Clara had carefully, reverently taken it down in the quiet hours before dawn, folding it away into an old cedar chest in the bedroom. It was a silent, monumental act of closure, a declaration that she would no longer allow her life to be defined by a monument of grief. She was stepping out of the graveyard of her past and into the vibrant, living warmth of the present. When the heavy wooden door opened, Elias Thorne stepped over the threshold, bringing with him the crisp, vital scent of pine needles and cold winter air. He paused, his striking hazel eyes immediately scanning the wall, a profound, deeply moved softness softening the rugged lines of his handsome profile. When he noticed the empty peg, he looked across the room at Clara, who stood by the blazing hearth clad in a simple, well-fitted green woolen dress, her raven waves neatly brushed and her stormy eyes reflecting the steady, clear light of the morning sun. She did not look like the fragile, cowering ghost he had discovered in the rain 2 weeks ago. She stood tall, her slender shoulders squared with a quiet, resilient dignity that radiated from deep within her mended soul. "I have saddled the horse, Clara," Elias rumbled softly, his deep, resonant voice carrying a gentle warmth that grounded the entire room. "The mountain pass is clear enough, but the trail down into Oakhaven is heavy with fresh drifts. We should make the ride before the midday sun slushes the mud." Clara nodded, a soft, confident smile touching her delicate lips as she reached for her own warm woolen cloak. "I am ready, Elias. It is time to face the town." The ride down the winding mountain trail was slow and majestic, the massive black stallion moving with a powerful, steady stride through the deep snow. Elias sat tall in his heavy leather saddle, his broad shoulders forming a protective barrier between Clara and the biting wind, though he no longer needed to shield her from her own thoughts. Clara rode closely behind him, her small hands resting gently against his solid waist, drawing strength from his unyielding presence, but fully relying on the newfound fountain of inner worth that had finally taken root in her own chest. She had realized that true healing did not mean forgetting the life she had lost, but having the profound courage to believe she was still worthy of happiness, purpose, and love in a life that remained. When they finally entered the main street of Oakhaven, the town was already bustling with early morning activity. Shopkeepers were shoveling the fresh snow from their wooden boardwalks, and women in heavy cloaks were hurrying toward the general store. As the towering Cowboy and the beautiful, slender widow rode side by side down the center of the avenue, a sudden, heavy silence swept across the town like a physical wave. People stopped in their tracks, their eyes widening in absolute astonishment as they beheld the remarkable transformation of the woman they had so cruelly ostracized for 2 long years. Clara held her chin high, her eyes fixed forward with a calm, unshakable serenity that completely disarmed the judging whispers before they could even begin. She no longer wore the oversized, shapeless garments of her mourning. Her elegant figure was carried with a graceful, undeniable pride, and her striking, porcelain beauty shone with the brilliant radiance of a woman who knew exactly who she was. Beside her, Elias rode with quiet, formidable authority, his hand resting casually near his heavy Western revolver, his piercing gaze sweeping across the crowd with a clear, silent warning that the days of treating Clara Vance as an invisible, cursed burden were permanently over. They pulled to a stop in front of the general store, where a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered, including the wealthy banker who held the heavy, overdue mortgage on Clara's farm. Elias swung his long legs down from the saddle with a fluid, commanding grace, turning to gently catch Clara by her slender waist and lift her effortlessly to the wooden boardwalk. He stood beside her, an impenetrable wall of protection. As Clara stepped forward to confront the man who had threatened to take her home. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Clara said, her delicate voice ringing out through the crisp morning air with a clear, resonant strength that made several onlookers blink in surprise. "I am here to settle the remaining balance on my late husband's accounts." She reached beneath her cloak, producing a small, heavy leather pouch of coin. The accumulated earnings from the prime timber Elias had helped her harvest and clear from the lower valley during his stay. She placed the pouch firmly into the banker's startled, callous hand, her stormy eyes locking onto his with an unyielding intensity that demanded absolute respect. "The farm is fully paid for, sir, and I intend to keep it." The banker swallowed hard, looking from the heavy purse of coin to the towering, rugged cowboy whose massive shadow completely engulfed the storefront. He nodded quickly, clearing his throat as he stepped back. "Of course, Mrs. Vance. Your account is settled in full. Have a pleasant day." As they turned to walk back to their horse, the silence of the town broke, but it was no longer filled with the venomous, cruel whispers of disdain. The local women watched Clara with newfound, hushed reverence, recognizing the immense inner strength and resilience it took for a lone woman to survive the harshest elements of the frontier and return to claim her place in the world. Clara had not just paid a financial debt. She had completely redeemed her standing in the community, transforming her tragic isolation into a triumphant symbol of hope and enduring survival. Back at the lonely homestead, as the golden afternoon sun began to dip behind the majestic western horizon, casting long, cinematic violet shadows across the pristine white fields, Elias stood on the newly repaired porch. His heavy canvas duster was slung over his broad shoulder, and his black stallion stood waiting by the steps, its coat glistening in the fading light. He looked at Clara, his handsome features lined with a quiet, lingering sorrow as he prepared to say his farewells, knowing he had fulfilled his promise to help her rebuild her world. "You have your home back, Clara," Elias murmured deeply, his hazel eyes holding her face with a burning, melancholy devotion. "The town respects you. The winter wood is stacked high, and you are safe. My work here is finally done." Clara stepped closer to him, her small, delicate hand reaching out to rest gently against the rough, warm wool of his chest, right over the steady, powerful beating of his heart. She looked up into his rugged face, her stormy eyes swimming with an intense, beautiful warmth that had absolutely nothing to do with the grief of the past. "Your work as a laborer may be finished, Elias Thorne," she whispered softly, her voice a beautiful, poetic melody that carried the inspiring promise of a lifetime of happiness. "But your place as the man who brought my soul back to life has only just begun. The frontier is vast and lonely, but this house is no longer a dead place. Stay here with me, not to protect a broken widow, but to build a future with the woman who loves you." Elias let out a long, ragged breath, a magnificent, brilliant smile breaking across his weather-beaten face as he dropped his heavy canvas bag to the porch floorboards. He reached out with his massive, powerful arms, pulling her slender, graceful body tightly against his chest and burying his face into the sweet, midnight waves of her raven hair. The long, agonizing winter of her isolation had finally passed, replaced by the beautiful, enduring warmth of a true, redemptive love that had proven itself stronger than any ghost or any storm. As they stood together on the high mountain porch, watching the golden sun set over a world made completely new, they knew that their love was a testament to the undeniable power of the human spirit to heal, to rise above tragedy, and to find a beautiful, triumphant redemption in the untamed heart of the American West.